Section 1. A country shocked into asking what happened. The conversation opens with a sense of national alarm. The host frames Britain's military weakness not as an abstract policy issue, but as a live crisis. British sovereign territory in Cyprus has come under attack for the first time in 40 years. HMS Dragon has not yet sailed despite being earmarked for Middle East duties, and the Chagos settlement is presented as evidence that Britain may now be surrendering positions because it cannot afford to defend them. That atmosphere drives the central question put to Air Marshal Edward Stringer: what is the state of the British armed forces? Stringer's answer is blunt: not good. He argues that the current condition is the almost inevitable position after a managed decline stretching back to the end of the Cold War. Since 1991, successive governments took what was then called a peace dividend, but in his view, they kept cashing it long after prudence had run out. Britain reduced spending, shrank force structure, and continued to behave as though its old strategic reach remained intact. The result is a gap between rhetoric and reality that his policy exchange report calls the Seydoux gap. He explains that the danger has become more visible because the old assumptions no longer hold. For years, Britain assumed it would never go it alone in a major conflict, and could therefore piggyback on the United States for the less glamorous but essential parts of warfare. Donald Trump, Stringer says, has effectively called us on that. If Washington is no longer willing to provide all the enablers automatically, Britain is exposed. Stringer also gives immediate. Section 2. Managed decline and the illusion of global Britain. Stringer's historical argument is that Britain's military trouble is not sudden collapse but cumulative erosion. He traces the roots to the post-Cold War era, when defense spending began a long downward trend after the Berlin Wall fell. The Gulf War briefly interrupted that decline, but only as a blip. Since then, every government has sought savings while still preserving the image of a top-tier military power. In his telling, Britain has spent decades shrinking its means without shrinking its ambitions. That contradiction matters. Britain retreated east of Suez in the 1970s, concentrating closer to home, but later drifted back into a more global posture. Stringer notes deployments and commitments reaching from Bahrain to the Pacific, including carrier missions to the Far East and offshore patrol vessels based near Brunei. Some of that expansion made strategic sense, especially in relation to China and Britain's Five Eyes allies. The problem was that this renewed activism happened while defense spending fell from roughly 4–5% of GDP at the end of the Cold War to around 2%, depending on measurement. He argues that politicians and military leaders alike succumbed to boosterism around global Britain. The armed forces kept trying to cover the High North, the Falklands, the Gulf, the Pacific, and more, while becoming smaller and hollower. A long carrier deployment might project prestige, but it also takes quite a chunk out of the fighting power that's available. Ships and aircraft return worn down, requiring refit and recovery, leaving less available for actual emergencies. The most important change in Stringer's account is that the strategic environment has become less. Section 3. The Navy, too few ships, too little slack. The Royal Navy becomes Stringer's clearest example of strategic negligence. He highlights one fact that sums up the problem: Britain didn't actually order any frigates between 1997 and 2017. A 20-year gap in ordering new frigates is extraordinary for a country that still thinks of itself as a leading maritime power. Since frigates have a planned life roughly in that range, the consequence was predictable. The Type 23 fleet aged beyond intended limits, ships wore out, and replacements arrived too late. The result is a remarkably small escort fleet. Stringer says Britain is down to around 6 or 7 Type 23 frigates and 6 Type 45 destroyers, well below the nominal target of 19 escorts that was itself once considered only a short-term minimum. HMS Dragon, the destroyer mentioned at the start, becomes a symbol of the wider problem, a highly capable ship on paper, but part of a fleet with so little margin that readiness failures become strategically visible. He is careful to separate people from structure. The crews, he says, are still cracking. British submariners are among the best in the world. Frontline professionalism remains high. The trouble lies in force size, sustainment, and planning. With only a slack handful of ships, bad luck and normal maintenance cycles can cripple availability, but Stringer rejects the idea that Britain's position is just bad luck. This is severe mass mismanagement, he says. He points to examples of vessels kept in service too long. HMS Lancaster, a Type 23 frigate, was reportedly in such condition that it would not even return from the Gulf before decommissioning. Section 4. The Army, 14 guns and a Bonsai force. If the Navy illustrates underinvestment, the Army shows what happens when underinvestment meets bad prioritization. The most striking moment comes when the host asks, How many guns has the British Army got at the moment? Stringer's answer is devastating. Britain gave its AS-90 howitzers to Ukraine, then replaced them with Swedish Archer systems. The total now stands at 14. The British Army has 14 guns, he says. That number is not merely low, it is strategically absurd. Stringer cites David Richards, who observed that as a brigade commander in Germany during the Cold War, he had more firepower in his brigade than the whole British Army has today. Finland, by contrast, has roughly 12,400 artillery pieces of one kind or another because it retains, maintains, and stocks what it might actually need. The contrast is central to Stringer's argument. Syria states husband capability, Britain discards it, and promises that a clever replacement plan is always just around the corner. The Ajax armored vehicle program becomes his emblem of institutional dysfunction. Intended as a reconnaissance vehicle, Ajax now weighs around 40 tons, is 5 to 7 years late, and costs about £10 million per vehicle. The whole program runs to over £5 billion. Stringer compares that with Finland's annual defense budget of roughly £7 billion, asking listeners to consider how much the Finns get for a sum not dramatically larger than one British procurement fiasco. The scandal, in his view, is not simply overspending, but spending on the wrong logic. He accuses the military and procurement system of insisting on bespoke British perfection, a commercial off-the-shelf. Section 5. Drones, Delay, and Yesterday's Battlefield. The discussion of drones reveals just how far behind Britain may be in adapting to modern warfare. Stringer acknowledges that the UK entered the drone business relatively early. He remembers commanding in Afghanistan in 2008, when Britain was using Reaper drones and carrying out early armed drone operations. But he stresses that these were high-end systems associated with the era of counterinsurgency, effectively replacing manned aircraft in permissive environments. That is not the same as mastering the drone war now seen in Ukraine and the Middle East. The host asks the obvious question, does Britain have anything comparable to the Iranian Shahd drones? Stringer's answer is simply no. He cites the Army's Watchkeeper program, based on an Israeli Hermes model. Britain spent about £1.4 billion trying to generate roughly 50 systems, never reached those numbers in service, lost some in accidents, then discovered the platform was poorly suited to the modern battlefield. The program was eventually scrapped. The RAF's Protector program is similarly expensive, £1.8 billion for 16 aircraft, around £100 million each, roughly the price of an F-35. Again, highly capable in one sense, but not an answer to cheap, expendable, mass-produced warfare. By contrast, Ukraine is operating at extraordinary scale. Stringer says Ukrainians are expected to build around 10 million drones in a year, up from 4 million the previous year. The host is stunned by the figure, but Stringer uses it to show that Britain is lagging not merely in inventory, but in industrial logic. The lesson of Ukraine is not that one needs to buy a few thousand drones and put them on a shelf. Section 6. The air defense gap and the end of the American umbrella. One of the most alarming parts of the interview concerns British air and missile defense. The host asks whether Britain has any equivalent to the systems the Americans and Israelis rely on. Stringer's reply is stark. No. He says this is not an accident, but a direct result of long-standing defense assumptions. Britain assumed it would never fight a major conflict alone, and so could rely on a US-led coalition to provide key enablers, including much of the unglamorous infrastructure of defense. That model let Britain specialize in high-end, Night One contributions, a slice of elite capability, around 10% of the coalition effort, enough to be seen as Washington's principal European partner alongside France. Britain would contribute top-quality aircraft, ships, and staff officers, while Uncle Sam supplied the broader system. Stringer says this approach worked politically and institutionally because each service could avoid investing in less prestigious capabilities. Ground-based air defense, for example, was not attractive to an army that preferred tanks and maneuver warfare, especially when the RAF could claim it would simply secure air dominance. The problem is that air dominance in the old sense does not solve the new problem. If the enemy uses hundreds of low-cost drones rather than traditional combat aircraft, then control of the skies is no longer enough. Stringer notes that this new threat sits awkwardly between land and air power. Ukraine may build 10 million drones in a year. Russia is really quite good at building them too, and swarms of simple systems can bypass assumptions that governed Western force design for decades. Section 7. Russia, electronic warfare, and the mental leap. Britain hasn't made. Stringer argues that Britain's weakness is not only material but conceptual. He believes the armed forces have not yet made the mental leap required by the new way of war. Ukraine has shown that modern combat is saturated by drones, jamming, electronic warfare, rapid adaptation, and cheap innovation. Yet parts of the British establishment still behave as though these are side notes rather than defining features. He gives the example of Russian fiber-optic drones. In Ukraine, drones are typically vulnerable because they rely on radio or electromagnetic links to operators, making them detectable and jammable. The electronic battlefield along the front is so intense that Stringer describes 40 kilometers on either side as a toxic environment of jamming, spoofing, and signal disruption. Russia's answer was a major adaptation, drones guided by ultra-thin fiber-optic cable that spools out behind them as they fly. Because they do not rely on radio links, they are resistant to jamming. He notes that some parts of the front now resemble a giant spider's web from the sheer volume of discarded cable. That example matters because it undermines the lazy assumption that Russia is technologically backward. Stringer says the Russians surprised the Ukrainians with this innovation. More importantly, it shows how quickly battlefield problems can produce practical solutions. War is becoming a contest of iterative adaptation, not just a contest of exquisite platforms. He is troubled by British complacency on this point. After Ajax reached initial operating capability, journalists asked how useful such a vehicle is in an era of reconnaissance and attack drones. According to Stringer, the response. Section 8. The Sustainability Crisis. How long could Britain fight? Perhaps the most chilling conclusion in Stringer's policy exchange report is that not one formation in the British military is currently sustainable in combat as a sovereign entity with the full order of battle. The host clearly finds this almost unbelievable, and Stringer confirms that the sentence means exactly what it appears to mean. Britain's force structure assumes coalition support so deeply that almost no formation is truly complete on its own. He says he tested this claim with a pan-service group of colleagues, and the only possible exception anyone suggested was 16 Air Assault Brigade, largely because it is a relatively light formation with fewer support demands. Even then, sustainability is doubtful once ammunition and supporting stocks are considered. The issue is not whether British units are brave or tactically competent. It is whether they possess the logistics, air defense, engineering, reserves, ammunition, and sustainment to remain in combat independently. In most cases, they do not. When asked how long Britain could sustain a conflict, Stringer is cautious because exact stockpile figures are classified and because the answer depends on the type of war. But he gives a revealing historical example. During operations against ISIS in Iraq and Syria, a comparatively low-intensity campaign, the UK already had to start rationing weapons such as the Paveway IV-500 LB bomb because global demand was exceeding replacement speed. He says alarms were being raised in 2015-16 that even discretionary operations were depleting stocks faster than they could be replenished. If that was true in a limited campaign, a high-intensity war would be far more dangerous. His implication